Good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to our OAG webinar today. This is the next webinar in a series we've been hosting since the end of March, beginning of April, I think it is, trying to keep you up to date with where things are in the world of aviation and coronavirus and how the industry is responding. My name is Becca Rowland and I'm going to be hosting today. And along with me, I've got Edward Clayton, who's a partner in PwC in Malaysia. Welcome, Edward. It's your first time with us, so thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
We've also got John Grant, Senior Analyst at OAG, and one of our usual contributors, and Mark Clarkson, EVP Product Management at OAG. Welcome, Mark and John, again.
Hi.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon.
As usual, the format is we've got about an hour to discuss a series of slides about the industry and about the market. We'll try and take your questions as we go through, and we should have some time for questions at the end, hopefully, as well. So do use the chat area to send in your questions as we go. We like hearing your questions, and it always keeps us on our toes. So the subject today is we've called it Strapped for Cash, how airlines can survive the winter season. So before the summer break that we took, we spoke a lot about the need for airlines to make the most of the summer period when they usually see travel peak. But as the weeks came and went, the combination of traveller uncertainty and travel restrictions meant that capacity and indeed passenger volumes weren't quite what we'd have hoped for. So that's left airlines even more depleted of cash and needing to look carefully at their strategies for getting through the next few months. That's part of what we're going to be discussing today. So what state subsidies mean, the number of redundancies, prospects for consolidation, and so on. But first, let's take a look at where we are today in terms of capacity and frequency. We've seen this map repeatedly. This is really a sense of where each country is in terms of capacity compared to a year ago. John, the summer seemed to peak at about 60 million seats. Is it all downhill from here, do you think?
Sadly, yes, I think it is, Becca, and I'm convinced that both you and Deirdre only have red and orange coloured pens when I see this chart every month or week. It's very little is changing. In fact, compared to previous years, the market seems to be slowing down earlier than in previous years. We always, of course, expect a reduction in capacity through the September and October period, but we've seen some quite dramatic capacity cuts in the last week from airlines around the world. So yes, it's not looking good. We're at 58.4 million this week, and you know, if traditionally we're about 9 million below that by December, then we're looking at a market that will be at about 49 million if we're optimistic, which is going to be just below half the capacity we had this time or in December 2019. And when you overlay that with the fact that demand is even softer than the capacity by perhaps 10 or 15%, then you can see that it's looking pretty gloomy for the last 4 months of this year, I'm afraid. It's not a good place to be, and we're already seeing airlines taking actions to address that particular issue.
Yes, I think we'll be looking at that in a moment. Let's move on to the slide with a bit more data here. So this is OAG's latest capacity data with the charts showing the flights this year compared to the same week last year. As the chart at the bottom shows, it's really we've not seen much growth at all, have we now, for a good number of weeks?
No, we haven't. And you know, if you look at the European line, for instance, that's actually begun to fall back quite noticeably in the last 2 weeks. EasyJet and Ryanair, between them, reduced capacity this week compared to last week by nearly 600,000 seats. And that's a huge amount. And week on week this time last year, they reduced that by about 25,000. So, you know, that gives you some idea of the scale and depth of the cuts. And yesterday, of course, Wizz Air probably confessed up and said that the recovery isn't as strong as they had hoped it would be, and their optimism is beginning to fade, and they're looking at parking aircraft.
They've been a very optimistic voice all through the summer, haven't they? You know, back in May, June, we saw them announcing large increases in capacity.
Yes, and continuing with the startup of Wizz Air Abu Dhabi and other such things, but I think even they are now beginning to realise that this is going to be a long winter. But it's good to have Edward on the webinar, because Asia is it's a vast region, obviously, but Edward sits in a part of the world where China looks like it could be stronger than it was this time last year, with Golden Week about to occur, and yet at the same time Singapore and Hong Kong continue to be in lockdown. It must be a fascinating place to be at the moment, Edward, with everything happening.
Yeah, well, the first time I saw this chart, I thought, oh gosh, Asia looks better than anywhere else in the world. However, when you dig a bit deeper, then you see there are really two stories happening here in parallel, if not three. So the countries with large domestic markets are recovering either very well indeed, like China and Vietnam was until the recent new outbreak of COVID, which they thought they'd managed to completely conquer, but it did come back, unfortunately, but not in a big way. So domestic market countries doing okay. A lot of countries in Southeast Asia really cracked down on flying. So certainly for me in Malaysia, interstate travel was banned, very rigorously policed for about 2 months in March through to May, in fact through to June. Since then, there's been some limited travel, increasing now. So what we're seeing on domestic routes is maybe a half of the usual schedule, a third to a half. AirAsia putting on more flights than Malaysia Airlines and Malindo relative to their 2019 schedule. Other countries in the region, similarly. The countries which do not have domestic flying, Singapore, Hong Kong, obviously much more difficult, and their numbers are really very far down. We'll see that on some later slides.
You were telling us yesterday, Edward, that you are seeing easing of travel restrictions across Southeast Asia, though.
Yes, yeah. So I suppose the two stories are the domestic versus the international. The third story is the selective relaxation of certain types of travel internationally. So for example, Malaysia and Singapore have opened up a green travel corridor for essential business travel. And they're allowing 400 passengers a week to fly between Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, which is obviously massively, massively down on the pre-COVID levels, but still it's 400 a week, which is 400 more than it had been up until the 17th of August. Increasingly, countries are saying, if you do have very urgent, personal reasons, for example, to travel, then we will be willing to grant you permission, whereas there was no permission for anything previously. There's also going to be some student travel outbound from this part of the world to particularly, I would say, Europe, to some extent to Australia and America, but less so than to Europe, during September, after which we're seeing things quieten down again.
And is that student travel, is that charter operations? I know that we're seeing some charter operations with students coming in from China into the UK, or are those students taking the scheduled flights?
Yeah, from China, yes. Generally from countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia, we still do have significant services by the Gulf carriers and some by the local carriers. So Malaysia Airlines is operating twice a week to London at the moment. There's daily flights on Qatar and Emirates. So there are ways to get back. Even during the deepest lockdown, Qatar was still running 3 times a week from Doha to Kuala Lumpur. So, there was a way to travel if you had the very unusual permission to be able to travel. Obviously, a lot of those flights were being supported by cargo loads as well. Mm-hmm. So the final thing which we are starting to now see, though, which is a negative, is that countries here are getting worried about resurgence of cases. So Malaysia yesterday announced that from the 7th of September, nobody with an India or Philippines passport would be allowed to enter the country, not even those people who have long-term residence visas, married to Malaysians or anything like that. They're all banned from the 7th of September. And that's the first time that we've seen a specific country ban like that happen. We are also seeing countries in Southeast Asia making nervous noises about possible resurgence in COVID in the Northern Hemisphere winter, and being prepared to do something about that. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of these country level bans are imposed on European countries, for example, in future. So I guess what we're seeing is countries are trying to relax travel a bit, but at the same time, they are not hesitating to switch off at relatively short notice if they see that that would bring in more cases than they've been having. And in many countries in Southeast Asia, particularly, we've been having very few cases. Malaysia typically running at about 10 a day, and many of those are imported out of those 10. So they don't want more cases coming in. So there's a lot of nervousness there at the government level, and actually, frankly, a lot of support by the population in many of these countries to minimize travel, because people are afraid of COVID, perhaps because of the SARS impact that we had 10 plus years ago. People saw what happened then and they don't want it to happen again.
Yeah, you can see why with so much uncertainty. I think, John, you were telling me earlier that Australia yesterday said that they're not expecting international aviation to return really till, was it the second half of next year?
Second half of next year, to see any noticeable uptick, Becca. So it's yeah, it's quite alarming. We sit, second day of September, and we're already hypothesizing around no return to international demand in some major markets until second half of next year, which is really, really alarming. And yet, on the other side of a coin, Vietnam today has indicated its willingness to look at opening the market for scheduled services back to both Japan and South Korea. So it's a really, really confusing, very, very dynamic situation at a bilateral level between countries around the world.
Yeah. So this data is just looking at our changes year over year by country, and we've taken a selection of Asian countries. So this shows very much what Edward was talking about. Hong Kong, Singapore still really struggling down there at the bottom in terms of the capacity return. Vietnam picking up a little bit from, it's gone back and forth over the summer, a little bit better this week than last week. And China doing very well, and as Edward said, that number masks the fact that we've seen a bit of a resurgence in domestic capacity, but the international is well below where it was.
We have, but I think in China, what we got to remember is, at what price is that demand being created at, and is it sustainable? We hear of incredibly cheap fares being available. And until, of course, we get to see some of the data that's coming out of the market in a few months' time, we can only ponder whether they're at the same level or probably 30–40% lower than last year. And the price of oil has just notched up a little bit in the last few weeks as well. So it begs the question. It's going to be one of the struggles, not just in China, but in other parts of the world. Is it actually profitless capacity and operation?
Yeah, I think that story is going to be a bit mixed. I mean, I'm seeing ex-Southeast Asia fares typically double what you were paying pre-COVID, but with very restricted flights and very hard to actually get permission to fly. So I think in those sorts of situations, the yields are quite good, albeit not many passengers. China, obviously, a lot of flexibility for the airlines to fly off a seat, so then they're hunting the market. So, like many things here, it looks like a very mixed story of different markets responding in different ways.
Yeah, and as one of the great challenges we have, Becca, within the industry is that a lot of passengers who booked long haul travel for the April to July period of this year were holiday VFR type travelers, and many of those were basically rolled forward 12 months and just said, I'll keep I'll keep my trip, but move it forward 12 months. So we have a bizarre situation where actually there is little or no capacity, no demand that has been built up in the last 5 months for this winter season. And yet, if airlines can get through to perhaps April of next year or even May of next year, and they right size capacity to what will be existing demand that's already booked, trying to buy a fare for travel next summer might be extremely expensive because the normal revenue management parameters are going to kick in very early this year compared to previous occasions. So it's a really interesting, fluid situation. You know, if airlines can get through the next winter, then perhaps next summer with the right-sized aircraft, it could actually be quite a good season for the airlines that are still operating.
Interesting, interesting. We're going to go to a different slide now. This is some new information that we haven't shown before, and it comes from a data source called Sherpa, and this shows, it's a sort of pictorial sense of where restrictions are at the moment, and what it effectively shows is these are restrictions into each country. So if you want to have unrestricted travel between two countries, it's actually pretty difficult to find a traffic flow where it's unrestricted in both directions, which just shows how difficult it is to travel at the moment. Mark, are you able to say a little bit about this Sherpa data that OAG is looking to include in some of its data sources?
Yeah, sure. I'll give a little bit of the background. Yeah, we've been doing a little bit of work with Sherpa, just experimenting with their data. And Sherpa's a provider of essentially travel identification requirements for the travel industry as a whole. And so we've just been starting to experiment with the data and see, you know, how we can join that with our data and our products, because it can be very helpful for a bunch of different sectors. But I'll very quickly just kind of illustrate or discuss what we've illustrated here. So in terms of completely closed, that essentially means that international travellers are not permitted to enter those countries. There are some slight exceptions to that, so it's not like full closed. Partially closed, in that case, we're suggesting that arrival from specific countries is not permitted. So kind of touching on some of the things that Edward mentioned earlier on. And no restrictions means that international travellers are permitted from any country. However, quarantine may still be required. So obviously the UK on there is a nice shade of green, but as we know, there are quarantines from a list of countries. And then obviously there's a few that are there that are unknown where we don't have the data for it. So we're kind of early stages, just experimenting with the data. As I say, looking how we can join that together, but along with the capacity data, or the actual flown data that we have, understanding what the travel restrictions and visa requirements are, given how much they are changing and how frequently they are changing, it could be quite an interesting data set.
Yeah, so this, I find it really interesting, and obviously this is a real sort of, it's very difficult to express all of the restrictions that are there in one map like this. So as you say, the UK appears green, but actually there's still quarantines there.
Yeah.
But the data itself is at a country pair level, isn't it? So it seems to me that's really helpful in this time. And I know when we were talking to Edward before this, we were talking to him yesterday, you were saying, Edward, that the restrictions are affecting the way people travel. So if you want to fly from Malaysia to the UK, you'll take a non-stop flight now, because in the past you might have traveled via the Middle East, via Dubai or Doha or somewhere, but actually those journeys, those connecting journeys, might require a quarantine on arrival now, whereas the direct flight from Malaysia might not. And so there's a whole range of other things that travellers have to take into account when they're thinking about how to fly.
And indeed better airlines.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've just been through a process of rebooking my son from Qatar Airways onto Malaysia Airlines for his trip to the UK at the end of this month for university. Basically, if he'd flown through Qatar, he would have had to do 2 weeks quarantine for sure. At the moment, Malaysian no quarantine requirement on arrival into the UK. Another option could have been Turkish, which right now or at least last time I looked, didn't require quarantine, but there's a risk that it might be imposed. So essentially looking for a non-stop flight becomes very attractive in situations like this, because you just don't want to suddenly find yourself having 2 weeks of quarantine, even though when you booked the ticket, that wasn't the case.
Yes, and earlier in the summer, we were talking about, we could see that non-stop flights would become more attractive, but for different reasons. And now it's about the quarantine. At that point, it was, you know, we foresaw that people wouldn't want to mingle with people in a hub environment where people are coming from all sorts of places, that experience of a hub airport may be less attractive. But now the reasons are slightly different.
And Becca, I think, you know, this goes, but it goes back to what we were saying right at the beginning for carriers such as Emirates and Qatar in Doha and Etihad, balancing your network when you are so dependent on international to international connectivity, and making sure that you can, you know, engage in some of those 6 freedom flows that are so important to your business is almost impossible. With countries like the United Kingdom changing its quarantine requirements on a weekly basis, people are exposed to booking a ticket and then finding that they're suddenly exposed to 2 weeks of quarantine because a rule has been changed at very short notice. It's very, very frustrating for airlines and for the passengers, perhaps more so for the airlines, because, you know, they can't plan, they cannot build their networks. They cannot begin to think about a winter operation, and we need to be much more resilient in the way we handle at a bilateral level entry requirements.
And are we going to see passengers looking for more flexible tickets? Are travellers going to trade up to pay more for the flexible tickets to give them more choices?
So yes, absolutely. And I'm seeing two specific things. One is those Middle East carriers that we've just been talking about. They are actually being very creative about trying to persuade you to book, giving you, COVID tests, giving you vouchers if you need to change at short notice, making it very clear that they will understand your need for flexibility. The other thing I'm seeing, and again, this is Malaysia Airlines, is that they've introduced a new economy flex fare, which is only about $40 more than the restricted fare. And it's very, very tempting to pay that extra $40. In fact, that's what I'm doing for sure every time I book a ticket now, which isn't very often. But you say, well, for an extra $40, knowing that I can get a refund, knowing that I can change with no issues, I think I want that. Thank you very much. So I think airlines are saying, okay, we need to build in flex to give people the confidence to book.
Becca, we've also seen over the weekend, of course, all of the major US airlines waive their normal booking fees for changes to reservations, etc. And in the case of United Airlines, saying that's a permanent change, although the cynic would say it's a permanent change until they become better, and they'll just create a new fare with a new rule, because that's what we've seen happen in the past. But you know, that is all great stuff, and it gives the consumer flexibility. But what we're also now doing is blurring the lines between the booking curves of a leisure passenger and those of a business passenger. And you know, that is in the long term going to create some real challenges for airlines and their revenue management teams in how they're going to both maximize yield and at the same time stimulate that cash flow they want in advance. Why would you book 6 months in advance in today's world? You know, that's a very brave call.
Okay, well, that's great. Thank you very much. Let's move on now. We're going to have a look now at how capacity has been changing. And for those of you who've listened to the webinars before, this is a way of looking at the market that we've used before. So in the slide here, we're seeing global seats, and each of the yellow lines shows a snapshot in time. So the OAG Analyzer product, Schedules Analyzer, allows you to go back and look at a previous point in time using the snapshot feature. So that's what I've done here, and the thick yellow line, sort of gold coloured line, is the latest set of data, 31st of August schedule, and then each of the others is a previous week. And you can see how, as the weeks have gone by since the 20th of April, this thinner yellow line here, when the airlines, according to their schedules, at least it appeared that they thought that by July we'd be looking at capacity where it was last year. And then as the weeks have gone by, they've taken out more and more. And even more's come out, hasn't it, this last few weeks, John? Do you want to speak to that and what we're seeing there?
Yeah, so as I said, I mean, we peaked around 60 million at the beginning of August on a weekly basis, but on a regular week-to-week basis, we have been seeing between 1.5 and 3 million seats a week being removed at less than 7 days' notice from the schedules, as airlines grapple with trying to get back to some sort of normality. And a lot of that is being caused by factors such as short notice, blunt instrument, quarantine requirements in particular countries that are close to home for some of us. And it's just very, very frustrating. At this moment in time, we are expecting next week, or the airlines are expecting to be operating about 61 million seats. This moment in time, we know this week is 58.4. We know there is some capacity that is inevitably going to be removed in Latin America because planned relaunches and startups in Argentina, Brazil, Peru, and Colombia are not going to materialize. So it's a very, it's a very frustrating, flexible, dynamic, fast-moving situation. And of course, for the traveller, you're still wondering, am I booking onto a flight that is definitely going to operate next week, or will it be consolidated or combined, or even just cancelled, and I'll end up with a voucher? And I can see that pattern running all the way through. At the moment, Becca, what you're seeing from the 6th of November onwards, quite frankly, is airlines holding on to slots at various airports because they're still waiting for clarity about whether there's going to be a waiver of the use it or lose it slot rules for winter 2020-21 season. And
so that's quite late, isn't it? Usually they would have handed back slots, is that right, over the last week, if they weren't looking to use them for winter?
Slots would have been handed back, and we'd normally be seeing by now what you see is what you get would probably be the mantra at this time of year for the winter. And please, regulators, make some decisions, get off the fence and tell the airlines what they can and cannot do. They're waiting for your guidance. We just need leadership and direction from the authorities, and the airlines can respond accordingly. At the moment, they're just looking at their so-called leaders, waiting for some guidance and direction.
It seems like it's a really difficult situation for the airlines, doesn't it? Because if you know that going into this winter season, you need to preserve cash. You don't really want to be operating flights you don't need to. And yet this says to me that from the 6th of November, the schedule has more capacity than it needs still.
Well, when we entered COVID-19, Becca, you may remember there were some airlines who were being criticised because they were literally almost flying empty aircraft to maintain slots at prime European airports. And only after the dispensation was given did those flights really stop. And the environmentalists had a field day with that. So, quite frankly, the aviation industry scores more own goals than Brighton do at Liverpool every season. That's at least a couple. So we need to get a bit more of a grip of what's going on and work in a coordinated fashion.
Yeah. So just a reminder, if you're listening in, please do send your questions in. We're getting a number of questions, and we'll try and pick some of those up as we go and answer a few more at the end. So do send your questions in. And the next slide might give you some reason to comment or tell us what you think about this. What we've done here is taken that latest data, the thick yellow line that we just saw, and said, what happens if we project forward growth as we've seen it in capacity over the last 20 weeks or the last 10 weeks or the last 5 weeks. Now, the 10-week growth is higher because it included that sort of early summer anticipation that airlines would be able to add a bit more capacity. And the last 5 weeks where we've seen growth flat, if we project forward at that rate, the year ends at 50% of the capacity we had at the same point in 2019. So 3 different views there of where we might end up this year. I think, Edward, when we spoke yesterday, you thought that bottom line looked quite reasonable, didn't you?
Yeah, well, interestingly, in, I suppose, middle of April, I was doing a webinar and I was broadly suggesting that the thick yellow line that we see here is what we were going to see. However, at that time, I'd also expected that the upper last 10 weeks growth line was the one which would then continue as COVID disappeared in the summer and schedules got back to normal. I think now the bottom dotted line is much more likely that we're going to see, if anything, actually a bit of a reduction in traffic during particularly mid-October to early December, probably then a bit of a pickup as people need to travel again for the year-end holiday season. And it's not just on holidays, but students, people relocating, that kind of thing will also need to travel. So I've shifted my view from thinking it's going to all come back to normal by December, or at least maybe 70 or 80% of normal, to thinking that where we are now, running at about half of last year's capacity, is probably going to continue at least until the end of the year, probably, I suspect, all the way through until the beginning of summer season 21.
So that view means that we're going to see another 350 million seats come out of the schedule this year, doesn't it?
It does, and I think we, my view of 2 weeks ago is it just continues to harden. And we were one of the first to call 2024 as possibly the point of a return, and we were one of the first to call that this is not going to get any better. And I just feel that we're in a situation where the reality is we did peak in the first week of August, and notwithstanding Golden Week and Labor Day, which is coming up next weekend, and Thanksgiving, the business demand has not returned. The meetings, conference and exhibition market has not returned and will not return. Every major conference around the world, I think, has been cancelled through to probably March. So yeah, this is probably a fair reflection of where we are.
Yeah. And given the sort of typical winter reductions in a normal world, John, would we think we should be looking at a further dip, as given everything that yourself and Edward have just talked about, from November through March, actually a noticeable chunk off that line, even the last 5 week growth number?
Absolutely, Mark.
South, surely.
Yeah, I think it could, and maybe now's the moment to take a walk to Beachy Head and look over the cliff, because it's pretty grim. And if we are at 58, and as I say, we could be below 50 by year end unless we find a vaccine or some dramatic development occurs, and there's no real sign of that happening at the moment, I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, I think there are basically 2 possible outcomes here. One is that COVID really explodes again in the cold weather as a Northern Hemisphere winter, in which case actually even 50% is going to be optimistic. The other is that Northern Hemisphere countries manage to keep things under control, and that we see by December that actually things are looking not too bad, in which case I suspect we'll start to see some recovery from probably mid-December and through the early part of next year. But it really depends on whether governments feel confident, and a lot of that is going to depend on whether COVID is kept under control. We're seeing the Southern Hemisphere at the moment is struggling in their winter. South America, Australia have had resurgences. So we really need to see what happens over the next 6 to 8 weeks in the Northern Hemisphere, and whether it comes back or whether the governments manage to keep it under control.
Yeah. So all this change in capacity, it must be quite difficult, I guess, for OEG just to keep on top of the schedule. This slide shows over the week since the 20th of July how that capacity's come out for the month of September. So we started back in July thinking that September had about 80 million seats in there, and now we're at about 41 million. So Mark, that's a huge amount of schedule changes for you to keep on top of, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean it's busy enough in a normal time. The number of changes that we receive. I think, and we've touched on it before. I think each airline has had their own battles to fight, and the way that they've managed their schedule. The passengers that they've got already with bookings, trying to repatriate those bookings, keep them within their systems when they themselves are running with a skeleton crew at best sometimes, and trying to manage that through their own processes to look after each of those passengers. And John's been quite vocal about one or two airlines who have been looking very purely at the next sort of 3-4 week period, and leaving their schedule as is for that period further out. And I think this is kind of an illustration of that airlines are just very much focused on the here and now, and as obviously they get closer to those travel months, travel periods, starting to make significant changes to the schedule. So yeah, I think this is a good illustration of that, and that's obviously we're looking at the different ways of joining our data, so looking at the schedules data, but also the status data, and that can tell us a lot of good information about ongoing cancellation rates, and factors such as that to help give our customers a slightly better view on what is happening.
Yeah, we're not showing any of the cancellation data today, but we have in previous weeks, and it's been really helpful to see how the airlines respond when they need to make very sudden changes to the schedule. I think it's been really insightful to be able to put the two together. So we've seen with this drop in capacity, we've seen some airlines account for more of that than others. This is the list of airlines that have taken out the most capacity over that period, over the last 4 weeks, that is. So EasyJet at the top of the list, getting on close to 5 million seats, isn't it? And then a range of other airlines. Not so many Asian airlines, Edward. Is there a reason?
Well, I was just looking at Lion, which is relatively high up in the list, although it is a very large airline. I think the thing is we don't have as many big airlines generally in Asia as people like EasyJet, and those which are very large are generally the Chinese ones. So you see Air China actually kind of in the middle of that list, but as a proportion of seats, I guess relatively small. Whereas Singapore Airlines is taking out almost everything, like 95% down. So yeah, no, I think it's a factor of the rather fragmented nature of the Asian airline market rather than the fact that they're not cancelling. We're certainly seeing lots of seat reductions.
Becca, if you look at both EasyJet and LATAM, they are both essentially taking those seats out because of quarantine and continued lockdowns that have been imposed or changed at very short notice. I mean, I think every major European market that EasyJet operates to has been impacted by Boris's quarantine requirements in the last 5 weeks. LATAM, a combination of both, all of its major markets still being closed, but of course they need to restructure as part of their Chapter 11 recovery strategy. And Wizz Air, yesterday's announcement that we touched on. You can go through this list. Malta Air is really part of the Ryanair group, and that's as much a transfer of using the Ryanair prefix rather than the Malta Air prefix. So that's perhaps the only one. But as you go through this list, it's just full of carriers who would love to be flying and would love to be doing more than they are, but are completely frustrated by what they see going on around them.
Do we have a question from Christian Highlander, who said, if travel restrictions were lifted across the globe, what demand would you project? Will the supply still be suppressed due to lack of demand? So are you saying, John, that this is just about restrictions, and if there weren't the restrictions, the demand would come back, or it's not quite that simple?
It's certainly not that simple, and unfortunately timing is everything. If Christian had asked this question in perhaps May, and we had a summer season to look forward, a northern hemisphere summer season to look forward to, then you might have some more optimism about the future. But as we're heading into the winter, and given that people are still cautious, I don't think that demand would come back immediately. It would obviously be a lot easier to travel and confidence would be restored. But even when that confidence is restored, there is going to be I think a very clear pattern of how the recovery will take place, which is going to be domestic and then regional. And then, from there on to long-haul travel. I saw someone say at the CAPA event has been taking place today, and it's one of those things where someone says the blindingly obvious. They said that the European market recovery was more international than domestic, but you need to recognise Europe is a European Union, and essentially everyone travels within Europe. There are very few large domestic markets in Europe. It's not Australia, China, or the United States.
And Europe has a fairly effective train service for those sort of shorter routes, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and private car, much easier to use when you're doing some of these distances in Europe. So I don't think it's as black and white as remove the restrictions and everything will come back. But it will certainly give a boost to confidence. And then it becomes about the airlines and the airports and the tourism boards messaging and marketing about the safety of travel relative to other forms of transport and the processes that have been in place to ensure the highest hygiene standards.
Right.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see how people have reacted as restrictions have been lifted in our parts of the world. Typically, John, as you say, you don't get an immediate jump up in traffic because people actually don't quite believe that their journey is going to be trouble-free. So they wait a bit. So if you do a trip and everyone else is asking, how was it? Was it okay? Did anyone stop you? Did you get the police or anybody else going after you? And so you assure them and it was all okay. And then you start to see them. So there's a little bit of a pause at first while people take stock and think, do I really want to go? Then they do start moving. What we're seeing at the moment is that domestic hotels are very full. So people are moving around domestically within the countries and actually spending the money that they would have spent on an overseas trip that they can't do. So if anything, being prepared to spend a bit more than they would have done before. So that's been a very interesting reaction. On the sorry, go ahead.
I've seen a new phrase appear in the last couple of days, which is called revenge spending, where people are going out and buying brand new cars because they haven't spent anything in the last 5 months. Now, if that transfers itself to the aviation industry, could we actually see a revenge spending where, from a safety perspective, people upgrade to premium economy or even business class because they feel they're going to be socially distanced from other passengers? It's a really interesting situation.
No, I am seeing that in this part of the world. That people are prepared to spend a bit more and have it's partly like, oh, okay, I've got all this money in the bank. Those people who do have money in the bank have often got a lot because they haven't been spending as much because they've been unable to spend. So they're like, well, I'm going to make myself comfortable at least. And perhaps they also think about safety too. The slight problem that we're seeing with the hotels, and I suspect this is also going to be a problem with the airlines, is that they've sent home a lot of their staff, and in some cases back home to other countries. They can't get those people back. And now they're trying to run the operation. And so we're seeing some hotels are actually not able to reopen all their rooms because they don't have enough staff available to operate all their rooms. And I suspect airlines as well. I mean, in this part of the world, Singapore Airlines has a huge number of non-Singaporean cabin crew, for example. They've probably gone home to their home countries. They may not be able to come back. Emirates, Etihad, the same. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens when demand does come back and whether the airlines can actually switch on fast enough probably not a bad thing if they can't from a yield perspective, but we may well see a bit of a delay as people reactivate staff and aircraft.
Very interesting, very interesting. It's going to be some. I think one of you told me yesterday that you've seen a job advertised for a revenue manager position, and I guess the revenue management teams are going to have their work cut out, aren't they? Over the next.
I think it was, wasn't it a route profitability manager in Malaysia Airlines, which is obviously a role that's not been filled in the last 30 years.
Okay, let's move on. I'm just going to touch very briefly on this chart. This is one we've shown you before, so it's no different to what we've shown before. Just to remind people that there is a sense that there are some airlines at risk out there financially. This data comes from ISCO. It's not hugely recent, and we've had plenty of discussion amongst ourselves as to whether certain airlines should be in which box. But just as a reminder, really, that there are airlines which are struggling, I guess, and have got to look very carefully at where things go now. So I didn't want to really spend any time talking about that, but just use that as a sort of introduction to.
Can I just ask Edward, because he sits right in the middle of one of the most high-profile candidates in the top right-hand corner, AirAsia and AirAsia X. Is it too big? Can it survive?
It's and everything I'm reading in the public domain is that AirAsia X is really struggling. AirAsia has a much bigger domestic operation, but AirAsia X has no domestic operation. So yeah, I'd say that the shorter haul AirAsia operations, they are certainly being very aggressive at putting capacity back in when they can, trying to maximize cash flows. So I think there's some reasonable chance there. The interesting dynamic I'm seeing with this is, I suppose, twofold. One is that if governments come in too early and promise support, then the lessors want to get their hands on that support. If they don't come in early, then the airlines are actually in quite a strong position to tell the lessors that they simply can't pay, but the lessors have got nowhere to go because there isn't anybody else who's going to lease the aircraft. So there's a sort of waterfall of pain here, and the airlines are not at the bottom of that waterfall. It goes beyond them to both the lessors and the banks that lend to the lessors on the one side, on the other side to people like ground handlers, to the airports and others. So the airlines are, say, in the middle of that, and to a large extent, the people below them in that waterfall of pain actually need the airlines to survive in order to come out the other side. So I suspect there are going to be some very, very interesting discussions happening over the next few weeks as people recognize that although in normal circumstances they might drive an airline into bankruptcy, in this situation it's actually very much in their interest not to do so and to accept some of the pain themselves instead.
Yeah, and of course we know from the US market, Chapter 11, which can happen at such short notice, is devastating for the airline suppliers, whilst the airline quite frequently comes out of it with no debt and in a better position than it went in, which is just seems a bit perverse, really.
So let's have a look at that state support. Again, the core data here comes from a combination of ISCO and who's collated all the data on state support and the capacity from OAG. So on the left here, we're showing the state support and the seats that were flown by each of these airlines January to August this year. And what that means in terms of state support per seat, which has some incredible numbers there. And on the right, we just show the top 10 airlines or airline groups by state support. And the chart in the middle is the data associated with the table on the left. So some very large numbers there of state support for each airline, certainly at the top end there. Singapore Airlines is big because they've not flown many seats, but.
Well, partly, Becca, and also because it's a more complex refinancing structure in Singapore than just literally a loan. It's an investment, and there are other considerations that need to be taken into account. But notwithstanding that, you can see the size and the scale and the strategic value that governments are placing on their airlines, even if they're public sector or private sector, and how deep some pockets have been to support those carriers through this period of time. And as much as you see airlines that are on there, there are equally a number of other carriers who are conspicuous by their absence. Very little state aid or support for Virgin Atlantic, who've just managed to refinance, and the IAG group, for instance. And in some parts of the world, the governments, quite frankly, do not have the cash to support them. If you look in Latin America, in times of a pandemic, there are much bigger issues than purely financing or protecting your national airlines when you don't have much public sector cash available. Similarly in Africa. So it just goes to show how deep this has been. And let's remember that many of these airlines are currently in discussion or considering how they're going to be financed through the winter period. So this principally was to take them to the end of October, and we have a lot more cash that's going to be required in the coming months to see them and bridge them through to summer 2021.
So one of the moves that airlines inevitably are making is redundancies and cutting jobs. So this is a chart that just shows the airline redundancies announced. When I totted it up, it came to about 190,000 so far. We're going to see more job losses, aren't we, John?
Inevitably. I mean, we have all three of the US majors in the midst of a round of redundancies. British Airways are letting or have made a number of staff redundant or changed their terms and conditions, and they're now in the throes of leaving the business. And it's the same in Emirates. There is a standout situation in the Lufthansa group where I know they are considering more redundancies, but if you look at the scale on the right hand side, employees per 10 million ASK, then that is not a nice figure for Lufthansa compared to every other airline. And of course, you can, there are factors such as how much of their work is outsourced compared to others and is handled internally, etc., etc. But it's a standout position that needs to change. And there's a mammoth game of brinkmanship going on in the US at the moment between the majors and the CARES Act, where the airlines, have made it very clear. American have cut 15 cities from their network. Delta and United will follow. 19,000 redundancies at American Airlines, and the CARES Act expires in 1 month, in 28 days' time. You would think that the US government and authorities would be in a position today to say whether they have a plan to extend and roll that out beyond the 1st of October. And we're just playing a brinkmanship with people's jobs and careers and lives. And it's just, it's just a horrible, horrible situation that we're seeing.
Yeah, not good. And again, I guess points to the fact that the industry is looking to political leaders, regulatory leaders, and so on to give some sense of direction and how to move forward. So one of the aspects that we don't talk about very much is just the rules about airline ownership. If we were another industry, we would expect to see consolidation. We've talked about that before, and yet this isn't an industry that allows consolidation in the way that other industries do. We have all sorts of rules about foreign ownership. In some countries it's only up to 25%, elsewhere 49%. And then the last few years, we've actually seen a few countries like India change the rules so that foreign ownership can be increased. Can one of you talk to this? Do you see this changing? Are we going to see more pressure to change the foreign ownership rules so that we can, the industry can start to respond and restructure in a way that will be needed, or is it a bit too early to be thinking about that?
Well, you'd hope so, wouldn't you? In some ways, you'd almost hope that the government cash did run out in certain countries and markets, so that normal business type mergers, acquisitions, consolidations could take place. And you know, airlines stop being seen as a national strategic asset. And indeed, if they are national strategic assets, why are they taxed so highly in some parts of the world? It's counterintuitive to have a national asset that you then tax to the hilt and frustrate demand. But the other part of this equation, of course, Becca, is not just what the ownership rules are, but are any of these actually worth investing in at this moment in time?
Well, I was reading yesterday that in India, the Air India privatisation has been pushed back as there may be new interest in the airline. So that I think it was just Tata was a potential party interested, and now there's talk of Lufthansa, Etihad, Singapore Airlines, Hinduja Group, was what I was reading yesterday. So maybe there are some bargains in the same way that we've talked before about there are opportunities, aren't there, through these difficult times, and we may see new startups, you know, as a result of, you know, there's plenty of staff going to be available, there's aircraft going to be available, there may be less competition on certain routes. So there are opportunities in the market.
In the last couple of months, OAG have received 7 new applications from airlines requiring an IATA code before they can launch services. And you're absolutely right. You know, timing will be absolutely central and crucial to what happens. But if a new startup airline in a major market can time their entry to the right moment, given, you know, the cost of aircraft, availability of crews, resources, and cash in the financial markets appears to still be freely available, then coming into a market with no debt, no burden is a great opportunity. But if you're going to do it, you've got to do it and go big. You know, it's not a small turboprop venture. It has to be a single aisle A320, 70, 80 aircraft business plan that would work, I think.
Okay, we are almost out of time. We've got one more slide, and then if we can, we'll try and get another question in, or a couple of questions. This is just a look at the winter season. So winter 20, the 22 weeks, I believe it is, of the winter season. And the grey line shows the capacity last winter, and the yellow line is showing what's in the schedule at the moment. So this really reinforces what we were saying earlier, I guess, that this doesn't look realistic. The schedule at the moment doesn't look realistic, does it? We should expect to see some significant changes here.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, I think last winter British Airways and American on their joint venture across the Atlantic probably had 10 or 12 flights a day from New York to London. It's only going to be 4 a day, I would think, this winter. You know, and all of that sort of stuff is still baked in and has got to come out. I mean, you know, we're going to be making a transatlantic souffle without any eggs this winter, I think, Becca. It's going to be that grim.
Okay, let's see if we can take 1 or 2 questions quickly before we reach the top of the hour. We've got a question, I guess, for Edward or for John. Any insights on state support to low-cost carriers? Interestingly, they didn't show up in the top 10 airlines with state support. Any comments on that? That's a question from Enrique.
There isn't any real support coming in Europe. Edward, I don't think AirAsia's picked up any support yet, has it?
There's a bit of a loan guarantee being talked about, but that's more implicit than explicit support. I mean, generally, what I'm seeing in this part of the world is that governments are being very, very slow to get behind anything other than their national flag carriers.
Becca, there's an interesting question about US airlines and ticket waivers, which was worth 2.8 billion last year. So, you know, it's an important revenue stream that's been lost. I mean, there is an argument that says, well, you may have put that at risk, but if it rebuilds customer confidence 1 month earlier than would otherwise be the case, then it will have been a worthwhile exercise. But I think there is a fascinating commercial consideration in the US that doesn't appear, or probably appears in Australia as well, which is the value of the credit cards that those airlines have with their respective partners, and how the airlines are now leveraging those credit cards and their value to secure loans in them to continue their operations. So, you know, we know that the credit cards are of extreme value to Delta, American and United, but I think even British Airways secured, I think it was a 750 million loan from American Express in exchange for additional air miles. So being put on the book. So, you know, there's many creative ways that airlines are capable of generating cash at the moment.
Right, well, I think we're going to call it a day there. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mark, John and Edward. Thanks, Edward, for joining us today in particular. We'll be back in a month's time, so the first Wednesday in October, that's the 7th of October, when we'll be giving you a new webinar with the latest insights. And in the meantime, please do look at the OAG website, oag.com, where we have a recovery tracker there, so you could see every week some of the information that we're presenting here, just how the industry's moving, how capacity's shaping up. So thank you all very much, and we'll talk to you again in a month.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.